that's okay.
Yeah, that's
okay.
You're live.
All right.
No countdown.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today for the first AIN workshop of the semester. Today we have Erik Pavia. He grew up in Canutillo, went to school at UTEP, got a bachelor's in business administration, then went on to Stanford to get a JD, and he is operations manager at a New York-based company called Notch. But now he's back living in El Paso, working as an adjunct professor at UTEP, and he teaches on entrepreneurship and new ventures. Erik.
We were talking about some of the topics that might be helpful to you all as far as like very practical knowledge base or skill set. So I'll try not to professor this up too much. If you have any questions, please just like jump in and like interrupt. Real quickly, how many of you, I know a lot of you work here, but or other people, like how many of you are like starting your own business or like the managers of your own business? Is anybody? So yeah, feel free to jump in if it's, I mean, I think there's enough of you where you might get something useful out of this. So I'll give a little bit of my background just so that you know what like, questions you can ask and like, what might be relevant. So I teach at the business school. I started teaching there maybe 2015, so about 2 years ago. The class I teach is, I don't think that there's a class taught like it in the country, actually. So the course starts with, if you're two people with a concept, how do you take that concept and turn it into a business entity from the legal side, and what are the legal issues that you face as you scale the organization? So, some of the things we cover in the course are, what do your founding documents look like? So what does your certificate of incorporation look like? How do you handle issues like stock splits with your co-founders? What does your initial employment agreement look like with your early stage employees? What do your financing documents look like? What are the different types of financing that you can do? So convertible debt or equity financing. How do those work, and what are the differences between those two avenues? We go all the way through that, and then we kind of jump to the exit stage. So what does it look like when you get acquired and when you IPO? I cover also a little bit on fund formation and like fund structures, so venture capital fund structures, and what is it about the fund structure that dictates so much of the way that startups operate? So again, I don't think there's a class. This I cobbled together from is essentially a corporate law class, a venture capital class, and a product design startup course. So it does cover like quite a bit of breadth. So if there are any questions that you might have related to any of those topics, like feel free to jump in with them, or afterward I can answer any of those questions. So a little bit more on like my tech background. So I did my law degree at Stanford, which I like to call Disneyland for nerds, because it's like the most well-manicured place on earth, and they've got like a weird zany mascot. So while I was there, I was at the law school, and I decided very early on that I didn't want to go into being a practicing attorney, but I was at Stanford and I wanted to take advantage of that opportunity. So I spent most of my time there focusing my education really around legal issues that are relevant to startups. So we said venture capital, corporate formation, corporate law, finances, technology licensing, product design. While I was there, I got heavily involved with a nonprofit, I think very similar to what you guys are doing here. It's a 501c3 that focuses on providing resources and educational material to Stanford-based entrepreneurs. So it's called StartX. So I was on one of the early teams of StartX. I think it just spun out of it used to be like a student group, and it spun out into its own nonprofit the year that I joined them. So we were like 8 people at the time. At this point, StartX is like TechCrunch calls it one of the top 10 incubators in the country. So it's grown quite a bit, but I was there in the earlier days in like 2011 to 2013. So I was specifically focused on developing our educational curriculum. So our thought process at StartX was that we were all a bunch of students and we didn't know anything about starting and building companies, and so we were going to try to teach other people how to start and build companies. Instead, what we were going to do is bring in experts, serial entrepreneurs, experienced investors come and teach the entrepreneurs how to do those things. So while I was there, I met a really great company. It was 2 young co-founders, two young girls about my age, and I decided to join their company after graduating. So I actually took the job before they had money to pay for my salary, but I figured they would figure it out, and I joined. So that's Notch. So I've been at Notch for 4 years. I was the 4th employee, so it was the 2 co-founders and engineer and me. So I've gotten to see the startup scaling experience from like 2 people with an idea, and then they hired me, and I took care of all of their like legal, finances, accounting, HR, hiring, firing, recruiting. I did our office management, so I was like, if the toilet broke, I was the guy fixing it. But then I was also the guy like negotiating or financings. So I've gotten to get a really great experience there, going from that stage all the way to where we're at now. We're at 20 employees. We raised a $10 million Series A last year, and we're headquartered in New York. We're building analytics software. So yeah, anything, again, if you have any questions related to that or where that might be relevant, please jump in. Also, I'm very used to, my classes at UTEP are 5 hours long. So I teach the mini-masters. So it's like 2 weeks every day, 5 hours a day. So I'm very accustomed to just like having a really long amount of time to talk. So hopefully I can get this wrapped up within the like 40 minutes. Please do jump in with questions. You're all familiar with this shape, right? So this is the hockey stick. And I think this is what differentiates a tech startup from any other business model, right? So most business models, you start somewhere down here and it's like a linear path upward if you're successful. But tech startups are one of the few business models where you have this like type of exponential growth. And the only reason that I put this in here is because I think keeping this exponential growth concept in mind is highly important when you think of like some of the implications of some of the decisions that you make in startups. Let's see. How many of you have not created your business entities? That you have a business idea, but you haven't actually created the formal structure around it? Okay. Okay. So I'll get a little bit technical. I think just for the sake of the people who like the Arrowhead staff, like in case you ever have to like discuss these issues with some of your clients or with some of the students or whatever, I think it might be good to understand some of these concepts. So I'll get like a little bit academic, I guess, is what I mean, but there should be like practical stuff in here for you guys to draw from this as well. So why should you create a business entity? So you get this all the time where people are starting a company, or I see this all the time with some of the faculty members that I advise or some of the young entrepreneurs I advise. You know, they have this idea for a product or for some cool new service that they're going to provide, and one of the questions they have is like, well, you know, why should I create a business around this? Like, why should I go incorporate? So that's really what I'm going to try to answer in the next several minutes. So when I was teaching this class the first time, I was like on Instagram, and I saw like one of those cheesy Instagram quote things. It was like, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And it was like totally misattributed. So this is either like Gandhi or Einstein or maybe Benjamin Franklin, but it's definitely somebody really good looking and attractive and interesting. And when we're talking about businesses, when we talk about like developing that exponential growth of the startup, that's really what it's about. It's like, how do you get a group of people to go somewhere together? Because you're not going to achieve this alone. And really, that's what building a company is all about. So what is a company? Again, it's not an idea, right? So a lot of people think like, I have this idea. So you'll see this all the time. I'm sure you guys see this all the time where it's like I have a company. Like, what's your company? Well, I made this app. Like, that's not a company, right? Like, that idea is not a company. That product in and of itself is not the company. The company is something else entirely. So companies actually has a base in 2 Latin words. So the first is together and the second is bread. And what it literally means is to break bread together. So a company is a group of people working together on something. And it started from this idea of like getting together as a group and breaking bread. And when you think of like what a startup is, or what a company is, that's like literally what it is, right? You're working together, and at the end you have some sort of payoff that you share. And what the company does, because you're working as a group of people, what the actual structural piece does is it helps you manage the relationships between those various people. So to put it in a different way, a company is a collection of relationships, and it manages the relationships between those various people. So it serves as like an intermediary, and I'll give you guys an example now. Actually, so this is like a very like law nerd concept. So are any of you familiar with like the theory of the firm? So there's a concept in economics and law called like the theory of the firm, and it's research into like why do business organizations happen in the first place? Like what are the economic reasons for business organizations? And one of the theories that came out of I think it was like the late 70s, was that business entities are great at serving as like a central repository for your contracts. So if you're an econ nerd, you can look into the nexus of contracts. So the company serves as the central organizing force for various interests, is another way to put that. And I'll run through a very quick example. So let's say you're a person and you have an idea for a company or for like a product. And you go out and you recruit one of your friends who might be like an engineer, and maybe like a designer and a business manager. And the four of you are going to make this cool new product together that you're going to provide to the world. So you have to enter into an agreement with your engineer, maybe describing what the rates you're going to pay them are and how much, like what services they're going to provide. You have to do the same thing with your designer, and you have to do the same thing with your business manager. If there's no central contracting organization or no central contracting unit, all of these people have to develop relationships between themselves as well, right? So if you're the designer, then you have to work with the engineer to figure out like when you're going to get those designs from him, and you're going to have to like maybe negotiate what you're going to pay the designer in order to get those assets into the app, right? And so you end up with this like kind of convoluted mess. However, if you take the same example, but you put a business in the middle of it, like a legal company in the middle of it, those relationships become a lot more simple, right? Now you only have 4 relationships, each of them with this like central business structure. On the small scale, that's like a pretty simple example, right? This seems like pretty easy to manage, but this gets out of control pretty quickly. So if you add, just one person, that's 5 more connections. If you add, so you've got 10 connections here, and then when you jack it up to 6 people or 6 entities, that increases to 15. Right. So very quickly, the amount of negotiations you have to enter into, or the amount of relationships that you have to manage, start to get complicated and unwieldy. If you put a central negotiating structure in the middle of it, it like completely simplifies it, right? So this is the same exact amount of people, but instead of 15 connections, you have 6. Okay, so very high-level theoretical concept, but it's actually really important when it comes to practical implications of your business. So I have a few of these on why you want to have this like central organizing structure. The very first one is continuity. What do you guys think I mean by continuity? I don't think I put an explanation here.
Some ongoing consistency.
Yeah, some ongoing consistency, making sure that the business survives, right? Making sure that the business exists and can continue to exist. So there's this great book, maybe some of you have read it, it's called The Founder's Dilemmas by Noam Wasserman. Right, so Noam Wasserman is this professor out of Harvard Business School who did this gigantic survey. I think it might have been 2,000 or 1,000 startup founders. And he just asked them, he interviewed them on some of the challenges they faced, why it was that they achieved success in certain fronts, or why it is that they failed on certain fronts. And what we found is that 65% of all startups fail because of co-founder issues. So it wasn't because their product didn't work, it wasn't because their market was too small, it wasn't because they couldn't get financing, it's because however many co-founders there were, they just couldn't agree on fundamental issues. So if you haven't read that book, that's a great resource for some of the pitfalls that you might encounter as you start your company and as you develop it. He talks a lot about some of these issues that I mentioned earlier. He talks a lot about stock splits, how do you give people titles, really kind of like trivial seeming things that actually have really big important implications when scaling your company and trying to get to some level of success. So taking this back to our contracting organizational issue. Let's say these two nodes are our co-founders, and 65% of companies fail because the co-founders can't agree to things. Why do you think that might be the case when you don't have a properly structured business? Any guesses? What happens if one of those nodes leaves? What happens to the rest of those nodes? They might leave with them, right? Who do you stay with, right? Let's say you have two co-founders, and you haven't properly set up your business structure. There's not some central organizing entity in the middle. And you've built up this team of people, right? You have like your engineers, your early hires, your designers. Maybe you got like a sales guy. And you start to fight, and one of you says, you know what, like I don't like you, I'm out, and I'm taking the team with me. What's going to happen to that company? Is there going to be that same continuity? There isn't, right? So one of the really important things that you can do when you set up your business, or one of the important reasons to set up your business, is to make sure that everybody's working for this abstract unit called company. So if one of your nodes leaves at this point, who does everyone else work for? They work for the company, right? They work for this thing in the middle. They're not working for these two people, or one of these two people. They're working for the company. So if one person ups and leaves, I mean, they might try to take, maybe they take one of the other employees, but what does everybody else do? They can just keep working, right? So one of the most valuable things that you'll get when you structure your organization is the ability to create an organization that like out-survives you and out-survives other people leaving the business. So you know, some of the early things that you should be aware of, and I don't want to get into them here just because I want to, there's other issues, but like, you know, making sure that when you structure your business, you'll be able to make sure that, you know, if somebody leaves, they don't take the whole company with them. The whole company doesn't fall apart as a result of their departure. And if you're really smart, you can make sure that, you know, they don't take too much ownership in the company when they depart as well. So that's getting into more of like equity splits and vesting agreements and how you structure stock grants to your co-founders. If you guys have any questions on that, I can talk about that. Another big trap that you'll see relates to, or as to why you should have your central organizing entities relates to intellectual property. So who owns an invention? If somebody invents something, who owns it?
The inventor, if they do it on their own, or if they're doing work for the company, then the company.
Yeah, so actually it's whoever invents something is the default owner. What happens with your employer, like if you're doing research for a company or let's say for a university, is you have an agreement that says anything that I invent, I agree that I will give you ownership over at some point in the future whenever I invent it. And I agree that I'll perfect that transaction, that transfer to you, if you put any document in front of me that I need to sign in order to make that transfer. So by default, whoever is inventing something owns that invention. And that's actually like a really critical, really important point. Because again, what happens if you have this node of people and the inventor of like your key technology leaves? What happens to that key technology?
It goes with them.
It goes with them, right? And if you left on bad terms, because 65% of companies fail because the co-founders can't agree, right? If they leave on bad terms, then that technology is gone with them and they're never going to give it to you, right? They're never going to sell it to you because they're not happy with you and they don't like you. So one of the biggest traps that you'll see companies fall into is that they don't have a central organizing unit, again, a central contracting unit that allows the company to take intellectual property. So one of the most important reasons that you should form a business if you have like a product, or sorry, that you should form a company if you have a business concern going, is so that you can do an intellectual property assignment. Again, if you have this like node of people, You don't know who's going to stay on and who's going to leave, so you can't just like give everything to like the CEO, for example. Let's say there's like a sole co-founder or a sole founder, and all the employees are working for this one founder, and so everybody just assigns all of their intellectual property to that CEO. What happens if the CEO like gets hit by a bus? Right? All that technology is gone. So you want to have this like central unit where all of the intellectual property can be assigned, so that if somebody leaves, they're not taking the company with them. If you're a technology company, where does your value live? What's the value in your company? Where does it exist?
In your technology?
It exists in your technology, right? So if your technology just like ups and goes, especially if it's like a patentable technology and it's like the patent that your company is depending on, if the company doesn't own that and that person leaves, you're screwed. Your company doesn't exist. So a lot of, again, another reason why it makes sense to start a business or to have the organization as a unit is you need an entity that can take all of this intellectual property, and when people leave, it stays behind with the company. A lot of investors won't invest in a company unless they've had their intellectual property assigned from wherever the inventor is. The company has to own it, or the investor isn't even put money into it because it's too risky. It's too risky of a venture at that point. So finally, this is like the last quick point no, I guess there's two more. So one of the other, this is I guess the last like academic point, and then I'll get into some of the more practical concerns for forming your organization. So transacting efficiency. So this is another thing that people, I think you see this like this trap come up a lot where people don't necessarily go out of their way to form their business entities early enough. Is you can't actually have an investment in a business or an acquisition of the business unless you have this like central organizing unit. Using our example of a bunch of people working together without something to cohesively organize all of them. If you're an investor and you want to invest in a product with this group of people, how would you get your investment done?
You have to invest with each one individually?
Yeah, I don't know how you would do it, honestly. Like, yeah, maybe you go and you start paying out salaries to people, and they give you some sort of promise. I mean, you would just actually be one more node, right? And then there would just be like 7 more lines, and you'd have to figure that out. Same goes for like an acquisition, right? So if somebody wants to buy your company out or buy your business out, and you haven't gotten all of your agreements in place in like one central structure, that becomes impossible because you can't just buy out one unit, you have to buy out every single person who's contributed to the business, right? And so, I mean, you probably can't get much bigger than like a dozen people or something without that central unit, but like let's say you're a small startup and there are like 4 people working on a product. And I mean, this happens all the time in Silicon Valley. Like, there will literally be like 3 or 4 people, and like Google comes in and buys them. If you haven't structured the business in the middle, it becomes very hard for like Google to buy you, right? And a lot of times if you're building a company, like that's one of your success stories is this acquisition or this exit. Again, kind of getting a little bit into economic theory. Have you guys heard of the holdout problem? If 5 people here agree to something and 1 person doesn't, all of the power for negotiating is now in that 1 person's hand, right? They could be the holdout. If there's an acquisition offer and like 1 person doesn't want to sell and you need them, they now have like infinite ability to negotiate with you. So you can preempt that by putting, again, this like central organizing unit of the business. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more kind of nuts and bolts corporate formation. So another major reason you should get your corporation set up and why you should pick the right entities for risk mitigation. So does everybody know what liability is? What do you mean by liability? So I think everybody thinks like I'm going to get sued, but it's more than just that.
Responsibility for something?
Yeah, any responsibility or duty that you owe, right? And so it's not just like I ran over somebody with my car and now they're suing me. It's any type of responsibility that you as a party might have. So businesses have 2 forms of liability. There's unlimited liability and limited liability. And I'm sure this is all like, very basic stuff for the Arrowhead staff, but for the people who aren't like super familiar with this. If this is way too basic, just like jump in and let me know, and I can skip over this. But I'll talk about like limited and unlimited liability entities. So I mean, they're essentially what they sound like. An unlimited liability entity is an entity wherein liability can extend to everyone involved in the business. So to give a counterexample, or sorry, to give an example, if you have if you are the sole proprietor of a delivery service, let's say you on your own decide that you're going to start picking up packages and delivering them to people throughout Las Cruces to make extra cash on the side, because you see your buddies making money on Uber, and Uber doesn't have like a truck service just yet, so you load up your F-150 with like deliverables, and you start driving them around town. If you accidentally hit a pedestrian, who's liable to that pedestrian for their injuries? The business is liable, right? Because it was like I was driving my truck as this business owner. So the business is liable for their injuries. So all my business assets can get seized as part of paying that injured individual out. What else can get seized? What else is up at stake?
All of your personal assets?
Yeah, all of your personal assets, right? So if I'm a sole proprietor of a business and I have unlimited liability, the state can reach through and take my personal assets along with my business assets, right? So the liability is unlimited in that extent. I mean, it's limited only to the extent of like whatever assets you have. A limited liability entity creates a separation. So let's say instead of me being like a sole proprietor with my truck, I work for a trucking company. And the trucking company is it's a limited liability organization, and something happens with the truck where like the brakes malfunction and I hit a pedestrian. Now all of the trucking company's assets are up for grabs, right? The pedestrian can sue the trucking company because they had like faulty brakes. But can they take me, the owner's house away? No, it's totally separated out. So you guys are all familiar with that concept of limited liability and unlimited liability. Cool. So a couple of just like, these are the basic unlimited liability corporate structures. So the first one is just your sole proprietorship. If you decide to pick up and start selling t-shirts out of the parking lot or something, you're a sole proprietor. You don't necessarily need to go to the state of New Mexico and like file a form. Like you are officially a business as soon as you start to like sell something or provide services. The other one is a general partnership. Usually you have to have some sort of proof of existence, so like some sort of agreement where you've decided to enter business into business with another person. But again, these just kind of like start up naturally. If you and your buddy start selling corn in a cup, like at the NMSU games or something, you are officially like a general partnership, just by the fact that like you're working together on an enterprise.
Question.
Yes.
When would be a good time to choose those?
So actually, there might never be a good time to choose these. So I'll talk about this and then I'll go back to the pass-through taxation issue. So usually what people tell you is you should, you kind of preempted my point actually. Usually people tell you that you should pick one of these because they come with this special feature called pass-through taxation. Do you guys know what that is? Okay, so you all know what pass-through taxation is?
Yeah.
So generally, a corporate structure is taxed twice. If you're a corporation, you're taxed twice. So one is when the corporation makes a profit, that gets taxed. And then when the corporation distributes dividends back to the owners, that gets taxed again. So they call it double taxation. So let's say I'm an Apple and I sell a $2,000 laptop and I make $200 off of it, right? Or probably more because it's an Apple product and they might do that. So I'm Apple and I make $1,000 off of like this computer sale, right? Let's just call that a profit for like simplistic purposes. That $1,000 is going to get taxed against Apple. Like Apple is going to pay taxes on that $1,000. So maybe now I have like $6,000 left, right? And, sorry, $600 left in profits after the tax. When I redistribute that to my stockholders, that $600 is going to get taxed again as capital gains. So it gets taxed at, let's say, like a 30% tax rate. You're paying, I mean, you might end up taking home, I mean, what's 6 times 318? You might end up taking home, what is it, $420, right? Instead of the $1,000 that you made as profit. Pass-through taxation, all of the profit that you make only gets taxed once. So what you do is, like, let's say, you have like a computer shop and you sell your own computers, and you're like a sole proprietor. You sell a computer, you make $1,000 off of it. That goes straight onto your tax statement as just general income, and so you just pay taxes on it as income. So one of the major benefits of being like a sole proprietor or a general partner is you get this like pass-through taxation feature. However, states have been giving pass-through taxation to these types of corporate entities as well. So these types of corporate entities are both pass-through and also limited liability. So you get the benefit of having your personal assets separated from your business assets, but then you also have the benefit of only having to pay taxes on paying these once. So our limited liability entities, these are there are a few more, but these are like the basic ones. So your first one is your S corporation. I used to think it was for small corporation, but it apparently has something to do with the tax code. It's like the tax code, it's like section S or something. These are generally smaller. You can only have up to 100 owners. So usually you'll see large investment groups serve as like S corporations, where there's going to be like a limited amount of investors. You have your limited liability companies. So these are your most common types of companies for like small businesses. So you get all the benefits of pass-through taxation that you would get as like a sole proprietor, but you do have that like limitation of liability, which is why they're called like LLC. So you see most businesses will have the LLC kind of attached to them. Forming these is incredibly easy. It's really cheap. It's usually like a couple $100 with whoever your Secretary of State is. So these are incredibly common. You might have like a professional LLC. So if you have like a law firm or an accounting firm and you need some sort of special licensing, you'll have to form like, it's still an LLC, but you have a few other requirements that you have to meet. So these are like tend to be the more common ones. So these usually make the most amount of sense for small businesses, where you're going to have a small amount of owners or a small amount of like stockholders taking profits home at the end of the year whenever distributions are made. But they don't really scale to larger organizations. If you want to scale to be like a larger company, you're going to have to become what's called a C Corp. So C Corp is a more formal business entity, and I can answer any questions around the C Corps. The C Corp is a more formal business entity. Usually they have a lot more filing requirements that they have to meet with. It's a lot more expensive to form. So forming a C Corp might be anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 on the low side. But it does come with a lot of benefits. So you're not limited in the amount of owners that you can have, which is really important if you're building a startup. Why is it important to have unlimited owners if you're building a startup? Who owns the startup?
Offer equity to investors.
Yeah, so you can offer equity to your investors, right? So how many investors do you want if you want to be the size of Facebook? You want all the investors, right? You want Microsoft put in $500 million in Facebook, and it's like 30, right? But like, you want Microsoft investing in you, right? Well, you're also going to give equity away to your employees, right? How many employees do you want to have if you're going to be a massive, successful startup? Do you want 10 employees? You want thousands of employees, right? So you want to be able to have an unlimited amount of owners, which include your employees. You do run against the issue where you're taxed separately from your owners, so you get that double taxation. But if you're a high-growth startup, like that's the price that you're willing to pay in order to get these, to get investors in order to be able to give ownership to your employees.
Eric, I wanted to ask a little bit about that because I'm the managing director of Arrowhead Innovation Fund, and definitely get quite a few entrepreneurs who are coming in as limited liability companies, and we talk about the need to transition eventually into a corporation. But you know, there are some entrepreneurs or some companies that have been formed, and they've already promised certain equity as an LLC to a company, and when they come with their cap table, I got to tell them, you got to go back and revise, because we're using member units, we're not using equity, you know, stock, and it gets, you know, pretty convoluted there, and you know, so can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so I mean, if somebody, so it's kind of tricky, right? Because sometimes you have people starting companies who just don't have the resources to go out and form like a C Corp, right? It is expensive. You do have to get an attorney. Like there are services like Clerky. I actually haven't used them, but like my attorney friends who work in Silicon Valley, they recommend Clerky. So there's some low cost ways to get this done, but sometimes it's not feasible, right? In the early stages, like it can get pretty expensive. So you know, usually I think the major trade-off is, like, you're going to have to become a corporation at some point if you're taking on investors.
Yes.
And I think the major trade-off is, like, when you pay that cost to become a C Corp. If you pay it early on, sure, it's expensive, but it's actually cheaper in the long run. So the legal fees to just incorporate once are always lower than the legal fees to become an LLC and then convert it to a C Corp, right? Usually also because people mess up the LLC, and then you have to go through a lot of like paperwork in order to get the C Corp form. Like there's a lot of things, I mean, like what you're talking about, right? Where you have to go back and modify agreements and all that stuff, and that just ends up being a lot more expensive. So that's one of the pieces of advice I give people is like, look, if you do the LLC now, it'll be cheaper now, but it's going to be more expensive in the long run. So really, it just depends on like what's available to you at the given moment, like what resources do you have. For companies that have formed an LLC already. Really, all that, do you know how the transition works? Usually what you do is you create a C Corp and then it buys the LLC with the stock. The C Corp stock is given to the LLC owners in exchange for the LLC stock. So there's like, it's like a merger essentially. So again, it's a little costly, but if you have companies who promise, let's say they say, I'm going to give you 1% equity in my new startup. But it's an LLC, and it's like it's a membership interest. It's not equity. All that really matters is, again, thinking about it from the liability perspective. Whoever was given that promise, all that really matters is getting them to agree to whatever the new structure is going to be in the future, right? So you can, if you make a promise for something that like you shouldn't have made a promise for because like it's technically impossible, or maybe it was just like the wrong type of promise to give. You offer somebody 10% of your company in order to, I don't know, like work out of their office or something like that. Something just like absurd. Yes. What I always tell people is like you can take anything back as long as the other person agrees. So usually with the LLC thing, right, if you promise them 1% and you're going to convert it to a C Corp, maybe they are a really valuable employee and you want them to keep that 1%. They just have to agree to that change, right? They just have to agree to the change from being an LLC, like a 1% stake in an LLC, into being a 1% stake in a C Corp. That's not a problem at all. Where you run into problems is where you like overpromise things to people, and then you realize, oh man, I shouldn't have given that person like half of my company. And again, that's kind of again that like creating that central structure and having that in place in order to get those issues resolved before they even happen is really important. But once that's gotten messed up, I think there are a lot of different arguments that you can make. Like, let's say I'm the guy who, again, to use the example, like, I let you use my office space and I'm keeping 10% of your company, which is like a terrible deal, right? It's one of the premises of the show Silicon Valley. They like work out of the dude's house and he gets like 10% of their company, which is like a terrible, terrible deal. What you can say to that person, right, the landlord or whatever, is, look, I know we promised you 10%. Realistically, though, we offered you too much. You have no obligation to let us give you less. But if you don't let us give you less, then we're not going to succeed, and your 10% is going to be worth nothing. So it's better to take a smaller piece of something that's going to be a lot bigger than it is to take a big piece of something that's going to be really small. Again, depending on who the party is, if you're an investor, for example, or if the company has an investment coming in, a lot of times you can lean on the investor to strong arm those parties who shouldn't have gotten that promise. The investor can say, look, I want to invest in this company, I'm going to help this company become successful, but I'm not going to make this investment unless you give up that 10% and reduce it to 5. And so if you don't make that reduction, this company is not going to be worth anything, so you better make it. Right? Or otherwise this company is never going to be able to raise money from you. Right? So there's certain, that's a very powerful argument. Again, if there's a contract in place, or like an informal offer of some sorts, you have your hands tied a little bit, but I think, especially if the person's not providing continuous value, you tend to have a lot more negotiating power, right? Like, if they're not going to continue to be providing services for the company, you know, maybe you can maybe dilute them, issue a bunch of new equity, and there's not much they can do about it. They can try to sue you, but like, again, if they're not providing a lot of value, like, their hands are tied a little bit as well. I think in the early stages, especially where you have the investor coming in, the startup can have a little bit more of the negotiating leverage than you know, whoever it might be, like a stockholder or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it is hyper context specific, but I don't think you should be. I think it pays to be aggressive in those situations. A lot of times you see companies mess up, and they'll just it's like, oh well, like, you know, I messed it up, I'll leave it, and it ends up becoming like an incredibly expensive mistake. There's a great story of Facebook had a graffiti artist. You heard of that one? Facebook paid a graffiti artist in equity. They didn't have enough money for their Palo Alto office. So they were at their Palo Alto office for like 4 years, or not even 4 years. They were there for like a couple of years because they outgrew it really fast. But they still paid this guy in equity for some reason, and he ended up making, I think it's $200 million on their IPO because of like it was like a wall that he painted. So and that's money that could have gone to engineers, or something, right? Like that would have provided more value. So it makes sense to try to pull that back as soon as you identify it.
Yeah. I have another question, Eric, because I know that on my investment committee we have a couple of venture capitalists, and one of the other things that one of them really points out as to why it's important or better for a founder to establish a C Corp right off the bat, actually even before they get investment, is because then later on the question of ownership comes into question once they receive investment.
So what happens when you create your C Corp, you have to decide who owns what. As part of the creation of the C Corp.
Yes.
There have to be stockholders. I mean, technically you can create a C Corp that just has a board, but then it can't really do anything. But so eventually you have to have stockholders. And so when you create the stockholders, it forces the issue of how much stock everyone's going to get. And so it forces the issue, so people have to make the decisions around like what's your equity split going to be.
Yes.
So let's say you have 2 co-founders, is it going to be 50-50? Is it going to be 60-40, 30-70, whatever it might be? Like it forces that issue. And then when investment comes in, you know, like there's like it's on paper, right? So let's say, you know, like the co-founders agree that like it's going to be 80-20. Because one person's doing all the work and is really valuable, the other person's working part-time. It's on paper. If some investor comes in with like a $2 million investment, you know, the guy that's working part-time, who only got 20%, can't turn around and say, well, like, hey, half of this thing is mine, right? They've already agreed on paper that they're only taking 20%. If you wait until like all of a sudden the company is really valuable, it becomes a lot harder to make some of those decisions. Also, you know, what the investors might be referring to is it's very standard for stock purchase agreements for your co-founders, the people who are getting stock in the company, to have what's called a vesting schedule. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, the vesting schedule, like if somebody quits, they don't, you know, up and leave with their like 50% of the company or whatever, right? They only take the amount of equity that's vested. So maybe they'll only take 10%, or if they haven't hit their 1-year cliff, they take nothing. So it's also really important to get the paperwork done before that investment for that purposes. Is you want somebody, again, the intellectual property issue, you don't want somebody just like up and leaving with the IP before you've given it to the company, because that's what the investors want to invest in.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so one question that comes up a lot is like, why Delaware? So if you're forming a startup, you're going to get investment from a venture capitalist. They're going to tell you that you have to form your company in Delaware. I don't know if you're all familiar with that. There's a very weird reason for Delaware, which I'll just run through real quickly, because again, it's a thing that comes up a lot. People are like, why can't I just form like a California corporation or a Texas corporation, New Mexico corporation, whatever? It's cheaper. So this is Mark Andreessen's layers of risk. You're all familiar with Mark Andreessen. So Mark Andreessen is he was the founder of Netscape. So very successful. So Netscape was like the first browser, or the first commercial browser. He started a venture capital fund called Andreessen Horowitz. It's got hundreds of billions of dollars in assets under management. And so he talks about the different layers of risk that he has to consider before he invests in a company. So he's got founder risk, market risk, competition risk, and you guys can read through them. What's one of the things that you don't see that Mark Andreessen is worried about? Is there a legal risk up here? Right? That's just not something, Mark Andreessen, when he thinks about the risks that his companies are going to face, none of them are like incorporation risk or legal risk. And there's a reason for that. So when you're part of building out this hockey stick is being really, really good at something new, right? You're either creating a new market or you're doing something so much better than everyone else that you're capturing a market that already exists in a way that like nobody was able to capture before. So you're innovating, but you're innovating only on the things where you need to innovate in order to capture the market. You don't want to innovate on like absolutely every single thing that you do, which is where this concept of path dependency comes in. So you don't want to innovate on something. The best thing that you can do is just copy what everyone else is doing, which is this really counterintuitive concept for a lot of entrepreneurs because they think like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm supposed to innovate. I'm supposed to do things in this like brand new, daring way. Which is true, but only really for the things that matter. So this is one of my favorite quotes in life. So I can never pronounce his name. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's like a poet, politician, scientist from Germany from, I think it was like the 16th century. So he has this great book of just like anecdotes and quotes. And one of the things he says is the most foolish of all errors for clever young men to believe that they forfeit the originality in recognizing a truth which has already been recognized by others. So, essentially what he's saying is you don't have to redo everything, right? You don't have to like reinvent the wheel, and just because you accept some truth as being true doesn't mean that you're no longer original. And so this is where we kind of get into this issue of Delaware. People ask me like, why should I incorporate in Delaware? What makes Delaware so special? So Delaware is the second smallest state. It's not even the first. It's the sixth mostly densely populated state. It's named after some dude literally named Delaware. I think the only claim to fame it has is that it was the first state to ratify the Constitution. I don't think most people could point to Delaware on it. Right? Delaware is incredibly unimpressive. There's nothing special about Delaware, the state. However, more than 50% of all publicly traded companies are incorporated in Delaware. 63% of the Fortune 400, so the 400 largest companies are Delaware C Corps. Peter Thiel was the founder of eBay, and he started an investment fund called Founders Fund. He invested in LinkedIn, SpaceX, Tesla, Zynga, very well-known venture capitalist. He has an incredible book called 0 to 1. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. I got to sit in class next to the guy who co-wrote it. So Peter Thiel taught 2 courses while I was at Stanford, just like a funny side. One of my friends, Blake, was like sitting there taking notes, and I'm like, dude, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm taking these notes from my blog. And he just like put them up on his blog, and he started getting like crazy traffic. He was getting 100,000 unique visitors a month. So him and Peter Thiel just decided to turn it into a book. So him taking notes in class led to him being a New York Times bestselling author like 2 years later. Serendipity. So Peter Thiel, he's got 3 rules for like how do you start a business. This guy who's incredibly innovative, incredibly successful, and his 3 rules include be a Delaware C Corp. It's not even like be special or be smart or be innovative. Be a Delaware C Corp, right? So why does that happen? So Delaware has 1/5 of its state revenues coming from franchise taxes on corporations. What do you think Delaware is going to do in order to make sure to keep this up? What does Delaware have to do?
Really attractive.
It has to be really, really attractive to corporations, right? What do you think this number is? This is the population of Delaware. It's got less people than many cities. What is this number? The number of corporations registered in Delaware, right? So Delaware has to work really hard to make itself attractive to businesses. So the legal system in Delaware is very business favorable. Delaware has so many corporations that they have its own, there's a special court. It's called the Court of Chancery, specifically set up for corporate litigation. So if you were a business and you're getting sued by like your stockholders and you're in Delaware, you don't have to wait for like the docket to clear through like the divorce and the like car accident before they get to your case. It's all just business cases. So it's incredibly favorable to businesses. Going to our issue of like risk mitigation, because there are so many cases going through and because there are so many corporations in Delaware, Delaware has a very, very robust body of law. So if there's an issue that comes up, it's pretty easy to know which side of the issue the courts are going to fall on because they've probably seen the issue before. If you're a corporation, you want to operate under these modern laws that tell you what it is that you can and cannot do. If you're incorporating in Texas, for example, or like New Mexico, you're not going to have that same legal history that's going to give you the decision before you even enter to incorporate. So they just have a very, very robust legal system for corporations. So actually, I'll just cover this last point and then I'll wrap it up. So one question that I get a lot, I think, is related to the question before about like investment. When should you actually form the C Corp? I think there are a few events that are sort of triggers for forming the C Corp. The first is if you're going to get an investment. VCs won't invest in, smart VCs or experienced VCs won't invest in a company that's not Delaware C Corp. They want that infinite ownership structure. They want that very well-proven body of law that they can rely on, that they know how it works. I mean, another example of this is how many lawyers in California are familiar with New Mexico law, do you imagine? How many lawyers in California are familiar with Delaware law? Every single corporate lawyer in California, in New Mexico, in Texas, in New York is familiar with Delaware corporate law. So it's really easy to find attorneys to represent you, right? And if you're a venture capitalist and you want an attorney to review your docs, you can just call up whichever corporate attorney you use in whichever state in the country, right? They're all going to be familiar with Delaware corporate law. So the first is if you're going to get investment. If you're entering into any type of, how to put this nicely, if you are having disputes with your co-founder, where you feel there's a risk that your co-founder or some other person that you're working with on your corporation or on your product or your company, if you feel there's any risk that they might leave, you definitely want to incorporate, or that you want to fire them, you definitely want to incorporate before that event. Because again, if they pick up and take off with your intellectual property, you're screwed, right? They could sue you later for stealing their IP if it's something that they developed. If you want to use it after they've left, again, there's like the holdout issue. They're going to extort you for money in order to get that IP assignment done. So if there's any issue where you think that a person who owns the IP might book it, then you definitely want to form your corporation. Another one is if you're getting a license for your IP, so if you're a researcher, right, the university usually owns the intellectual property, the patent underlying your research, and you have to license it back from the university. They're only going to give that license to the company. They're not going to give that license to you as an individual. Because again, it's very risky from the licensor's perspective. Like, you don't want some individual running around holding a license to some very valuable property. You'd rather give it to an organization where there's going to be some amount of continuity. Let's see, what was the other one? Co-founder issues, donations, financings. If you're an LLC, again, and you're going to convert, I think, so the investor situation was one. I think another issue is when the company actually starts to generate a lot of money, and it starts to become worth something, even if you don't have venture capital interests. It's a lot easier to make that change before the company is worth a lot than it is when the company is actually worth something, because people are just going to argue about it a lot more if it's worth $10 million as opposed to it being worth $10,000 or $50,000. Cool, so I'm over time. Thank you guys so much. This is my contact information. If any of you especially guys who are like starting your own businesses. If you have any questions or want to reach out about any of this, feel free to email me. I spend a lot of time just like talking to people who are like getting started for the first time on their businesses, and I can kind of help orient you on any of these issues or any of the other issues that I mentioned at the very beginning. Any other questions? I'm like way over time.
So the challenge of converting from LLC to a C corp is usually that you